Hello and welcome to Choose FI. Today on the show, we have our good friend Sean Mullaney, the FI tax guy, here to do a mailbag episode with me. I've received a number of emails recently and seen a number of Facebook posts that are technical in nature. And I definitely wanted to tackle them. And I figured there's nobody better to have on to help me with this than Sean. So this should be a lot of fun. We're going to talk about breaking up with your advisor, I bonds, the 4% rule and life expectancy, Roth IRAs, and how to open an account for your child. So we have a little bit of everything here. With that, welcome to Choose FI. John, welcome back to Choose FI. Thank you, as always, for being here.
Brad, thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to answering some mailbag questions.
Yeah, this should be fun. So let's start with the one that I get most often. And this is probably the longest answer of the bunch because I suspect we really need to dive into this. So this is about breaking up with a financial advisor. And like I said, I've got a number of these. I'm just going to read Jason's. And he said, how do I go about breaking up with my financial advisor and transfer existing investments, traditional IRA, Roth IRA, and taxable brokerage accounts to a low fee index funds at, say, Vanguard? What is the taxability of such a move? My current advisor is charging 1% annually. And as I have built these accounts up over many years, this fee is getting to be quite high for what I believe I can manage on my own for a fraction of the cost at Vanguard. All right, Sean. So, like I said, this is something we get rather often. And there's a couple things here, but I'm going to let you run with this for the beginning. And basically, how would you answer that if somebody came to you and said, hey, look, I've been with this high fee broker for a long time. I'm paying a 1% AUM fee, assets under management. Presumably, they're in expensive fees. And because it's over a number of years, they have some unrealized gains in their taxable brokerage account. And like Jason said, there's a couple of retirement accounts as well. So it has a little bit of everything. Sean, I'm going to let you run with it.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think some in the audience might be saying, oh, well, this doesn't apply to me. And I'm here to say that for many in the audience, this will in the future apply to you. So there are three accounts we should be thinking about. One is inherited IRAs, inherited Roth IRAs, traditional IRAs. So this may not apply to you today, but it certainly could apply in the future. So that's one. Two is, like the correspondent said, traditional IRAs, retirement accounts. And then three would be taxable brokerage accounts. All right, so let's tackle all three of those. The first point I'm going to make applies to all three. Generally speaking, I believe you should start the process by physically calling, not just going to the website, although that could be part of it, but by calling the institution you want to receive the funds, okay? Because you're going to want them to lead the process. You do that for several reasons. One, there's an emotional component potentially of breaking up with the advisor, although maybe you inherited the advisor, right, from a parent or a sibling or somebody like that through an inherited account. But what you're generally going to want to do is you're going to say, look, hey, new institution who has every incentive to work with me because I'm going to them. Hey, new institution, I've got an account at XYZ. I would like you guys to take over that account. And the industry term for this is an ACAT, so an automated customer account transfer. Basically, what you want to do is ACAT out, and just Google ACAT, you'll find it, right? ACAT out the existing funds. So let's start with an inherited IRA. You want to ACAT that thing out from mom and dad's old financial institution to your own financial institution. You call your financial institution and say, look, I just inherited this account and I need a direct trustee to trustee transfer, an ACAT out from that legacy institution. And by the way, this has to be done trustee to trustee. For an inherited account, you cannot receive a check. You've got to do this trustee to trustee. So you initiate the process with the receiving trustee, and you also be very explicit that, look, this is an inherited retirement account because that requires certain titling. You can't just, unless it's a spouse, that's a whole other conversation. Let's not have that conversation. But for everybody other than inheriting from a spouse, you need to inherit it and set it up as an inherited IRA. That generally is going to have special titling that references the original owner, their date of death, you as a beneficiary, and so on and so forth. So that's like the big consideration when we have an inherited account. And that's going to be a lot of the audience at some point. Okay, so that's inherited accounts. What about your own IRA? This exists out there, right? Just like your correspondent mentioned. And it's a similar process. I mean, the titling isn't as specific, it's just your own IRA. But yeah, I would start it with the receiving institution. Say, I've got an IRA in my own name, and I want you still, even though legally you don't have to do it this way, you generally want to do it this way, which is that direct trustee to trustee transfer. We generally don't want to be receiving checks from our retirement account because that sets off a 60-day clock, right? So if we just get cash out of that account, that's setting us up for potential failure. Because if we don't move that over within 60 days, we could have a tax and a penalty on that amount. We just don't want to go there, right? So we want to go to the receiving institution. You want to say, look, I want a direct trustee to trustee transfer of my old IRA at legacy institution to you guys. Help me out, coach me through that process, right? And then on the third one, so the correspondent raises a great issue with respect to what about your own taxable brokerage account or even an inherited taxable brokerage account? He's raising this great issue about, well, you could trigger capital gains tax if you just sell it all at institution A, move it over to institution B. So that's where this ACAT really matters, right? Not that it doesn't matter for the other ones, but it matters even, for this one too. So what you're trying to do is through the ACAT process, achieve an in-kind transfer. So let's just say, this correspondent, I'm not giving advice for this particular person, but let's just say they had 100 Acme shares at old institution that's charging them this 1% fee. They don't like that. But there maybe is a built-in gain in those Acme shares. What they're going to want is to call the receiving institution and say, hey, I have 100 shares of Acme stock. Can you help me initiate through an ACAT? Can you help me initiate an in-kind transfer? So the receiving institution receives those 100 shares that you own at the legacy firm, right? So, there's 100 shares in the world of Acme stock that you own. You then, through this in-kind transfer, move them over to the receiving institution. Now they're there. They still have this capital gain. You still may have an investment issue because, maybe I'm not diversified enough, but at least maybe you got out from under the AUM fee. And same with any other securities you have at that other institution. You want an in-kind transfer. Now, in theory, maybe this person has a capital loss in this stuff. In theory, they can just go sell it and take the proceeds and reinvest at some other institution, trigger a capital loss. But that can also have some emotional components, right? That's the other thing. When you initiate it through the receiving institution, it does make the emotional component a little more manageable here.
Sean, that was incredible. There's a lot there. So, yeah, where you left off was with the emotional part. And that really is one of the most difficult aspects of quote unquote breaking up with your financial advisor, because in many cases, you've been with this person for years or decades and you have some type of relationship. So that's the hard part. And they're going to try to talk you out of it, et cetera, et cetera. But if, like you said, you go to the new firm that you're intending to move your money to, and again, this is not financial advice. You said that very importantly. You're not giving advice to this person. We're not giving advice to any one particular person. We're just talking through how we would think through this. And also, we're not in the bag for Vanguard per se. I know Jason mentioned Vanguard, but Fidelity and Schwab, I have accounts at as well. There are plenty of different options that are super low cost and reliable places to go. But yeah, you can just call up that institution and then they can be the lead on this. Like you said, their incentive is to get you to move your money there. So they're going to
Yep.
help.
Well, and the other thing too about it, Brad, is if you initiate the process through the receiving institution, maybe there is a subsequent conversation with the legacy institution, but you're going into that conversation having made the decision. It's no longer a decision point. You've initiated the ACAT, right? You've filed the paperwork. That's the way I would approach it in most cases. So the conversation isn't, I'm about to do this. It's, I've done this and I'm giving you notice. Now, technically you don't have to give them notice other than you have to file whatever paperwork is required. Now, there can be fees on this. I'm not aware that most institutions have huge fees on this. So you just want to do some diligence on, is there going to be a fee on the ACAT out? I don't think these things are that insurmountable. But, so it is just like a potential diligence point. But usually these fees are not anything that would, essentially be worse than the 1% fee, right? Usually that 1% fee is going to be way worse than an ACAT out fee.
Right. So it's just rip the Band-Aid off in that instance. Reading between the lines, what you're saying there is, yeah, okay, there might be a tiny fee, but it's not going to be anywhere near the 1% that you're paying in that year and every subsequent year. So, a couple other things that came to mind that I had questions about. So, Sean, you said before when you're talking about this, the fictional Acme shares, that, quote, you still have this capital gain. And what you meant clearly was you still have this unrealized capital gain. So, in this case, you're moving this, it's this in kind transfer, right? So, you're moving it from one institution to another. In this case, we're saying 100 shares of this fictional Acme stock. My first question is, so when you're just simply moving the shares from one facility to another, no capital gain is triggered at that point. It's only upon sale. It's only when you realize the capital gain. Does your new institution get the records from your old institution of the purchase price, your basis, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Brad. And I'm not 100% sure of the answer. So, what you may want to do, I'd have to dig into that.
Sure,
What you
sure.
may want to do is just grab your basis information prior to moving, just to make sure you've got that. And then we could also talk about ways to potentially manage that capital gain. I've never actually dug into whether they maintain that information. One thing I will say is there was a date back in the early teens. I think it was 2012, 2013. Before then, brokers were not necessarily required to maintain basis information. So if this is a 30-year holding, that information may not exist on their end, right? So that is a great point you raised, Brad. It wouldn't hurt to just do a capture of whatever gain you've got in there. But you can also ask the receiving institution and let them know when you receive or when you purchased these shares. If you purchased these shares in 1999, it may be that because they weren't required to back then, the transferring institution may not have it, and thus the receiving institution is not going to have any way to reconstruct that.
Okay. So, right. Just a simple note is couldn't hurt to jot this down. So, before you make anything, just make sure you have all your historical data. You can print it out, et cetera, and then you just have it. So, hopefully, perfect world, it goes to your new institution, but it may not. And you'll want that clearly. So, okay. Now, so there's two issues that are running in tandem here. I think for most people, it's like you said, the emotional part, the actual technical, like how do I break up with the advisor, which is how do I literally get these funds out of here? And now you've talked about that, the trustee to trustee, and these are in kind, but are there ever instances where there might be at the original firm, let's say, like, I don't even know if this exists anymore, but proprietary funds that only exist at that company and that you might be forced to sell? And then I guess let's talk about the taxable implications for that, which I assume clearly would be very different, whether it's the inherited IRA or IRAs, retirement, et cetera, versus the taxable brokerage accounts.
Yeah, so there are certainly, non-publicly traded REITs. There are all sorts of securities. The audience, I think, tends not to own significant amounts of these, but they do exist. So there are some securities that cannot be transferred through the ACAT process. In that case, you may be in a situation where, look, I'm not going to be able to do this in-kind transfer. If they're, for whatever reason, in an IRA, it's not a problem because you can just sell the stuff in the IRA, put it in cash, move over the cash, and you're fine, right? So this really is only going to be an issue for your taxable brokerage account. And there are some, non-publicly traded securities, potentially hedge funds, things like that, where the ACAT system wouldn't work. Generally speaking, the publicly traded stuff, you've got a ticker symbol, it closes at 4 p.m. every day. That thing is generally speaking going to be just fine on the ACAT system. And so, yeah, you may have a decision to make of, hey, I've got this thing that for whatever reason I can't do an in-kind transfer and I don't like this fee, right? So then it almost becomes a question of balancing, do I like paying the fee and having the investment issue because it's a concentrated position, undiversified, so there's that side of the ledger, versus taking the tax hit now on that thing. And I'd also say there are different things you could look at on the tax hit. One of them would be your own mortality, right? So you may be familiar with the step up in basis at death, right? So say you're 95 years old and you're thinking, hey, I might not be around so long. It'd be great to have a better portfolio, but maybe you just sort of leave that position just to get your heirs a step up in basis. And then on the way home from the funeral, they can solve the problem by selling with the step up in basis. So, yeah, Brad, you raise a great issue. I think the world is getting to a place where folks are embracing more passive type investments, which tend to be more publicly traded securities, which tend to be ACAT eligible.
Yeah. Okay. This is great. I think just one last point that I have such question for you, and then I think we've covered this pretty thoroughly. So, like I said, there are two things going on in tandem. So there's the actual breaking up, which we'd covered in full, and then there's the taxable nature of this. So as you just discussed, this is largely a moot issue for any of the IRAs and retirement vehicles, because if you had to sell, the taxability is not, hey, I'm selling these proprietary funds, or I'm selling these individual shares, or I'm selling these high expense ratio mutual funds within the umbrella of the IRA. You can do that and then just repurchase a low cost index fund. So that you're not going to have any taxable implications to my knowledge. But the issue for the taxable income perspective, I think, which is the other significant question most people have, that occurs, as you just said, in the taxable brokerage accounts, right? So if you're moving in kind and you have not had to sell anything, there's no tax issue right there. No taxable event has been triggered. You've just moved this over. But Sean, you're still stuck with potentially investments that you don't want, maybe high fee investments or some such. And I think that's kind of, and this is the art of this. I don't think there's a science necessarily, but this is where people potentially need advice is, hey, what do I do? How do I eventually, I've got all this money that's now in these investments I don't really want. I want to get a low cost index fund. What do I do? What do I think
Yeah.
about?
So this is the problem of appreciated stock, right? And taxable brokerage accounts. So I've got a few thoughts on how do we mitigate this problem. So one way is just to chunk at it, right? So maybe it's a tax gain harvesting thing. Maybe my income is low this year and I'm in the 12% bracket or less. So I could sell, and trigger some capital gain and then redeploy. If I can keep that capital gain in my overall tax bracket in the 12% or lower tax bracket, I pay no federal income tax and only maybe a little state income tax. Depends where I live. If I'm Texas, Florida, Nevada, I don't even pay that. So that could be good. And maybe I just chunk at it and pick up a little capital gain. Maybe I am in the 22%, 24% bracket. I'm still going to pick up a little capital gain, pay the 15% rate federally and move on. So chunking at it is one approach. Another approach would be donor advised fund or other charitable giving, right? So, let's just say you had Acme stock and it's got $1 million built-in gain. You become the sort of person that should never give cash again to a charity. You should just give this Acme stock to the charity. Now, yes, you can get a tax deduction for that contribution, but you now have an asset that has a built-in capital gain. Why not give that to a charity or a donor advised fund, right? Which normalizes the experience with the charity. We've talked about donor advised funds before. So either giving just direct stock gifts to the charity or giving the stock to the donor advised fund, wiping away the capital gain, that's another way of solving for this problem of appreciated stock. A third way would be something called a put option. This is the sort of thing I would only think about if the built-in gain property is a significant piece of one's portfolio. So let's just say, there's a listener out there, he or she is worth $3 million and 2.5 million of that worth is in Acme stock. If I was that person, I would be thinking about financial planning and potentially working with an options broker, potentially as something as simple as a so-called put option. A put option is the right but not the obligation to sell at a floor price. So let's stay with Acme stock. Let's say it's worth $100 a share. What you could do is you can go buy a put option on a percentage, on 60% of your portfolio, 80% of your portfolio, 40% of your portfolio, to be able to have the right for the next, say, 10 years or 5 years to sell that thing at, say, $65 a share, $70 a share, something like that. What you're doing is you're saying, well, if Acme has an Enron-like event and it goes to zero, I still have the right but not the obligation to sell for, say, $65 a share, $70 a share. I've locked in a floor on the value of this holding. This is not for everyone. This is not a go-to tactic, right? This is a, boy, oh boy, if Acme stock craters, my financial life is in a whole world of hurt. So this put option is an option I would look into. Now, the thing about it is you have to pay an insurance premium, essentially. You have to pay a certain amount per option to have that option, to have that right but not obligation to sell. So that's a third way of potentially managing this issue, but really only applies if that position is material to your own financial wealth. And then a fourth way to manage the issue of appreciated stock is your own demise, right? So you can just, as they say in the crypto world, hodl, right? Hold on for dear life.
Yeah.
And your own death, generally speaking, wipes out that capital gain through the step up in basis. That's a whole other conversation. Now, that obviously has downside from an investment perspective, but from a tax play, the step up in base
And
is a
from a
great.
quality of life perspective, Sean.
Yeah, from a tax play, the step up, essentially the best tax planning is free tax planning.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, that was a much more thorough answer than I even anticipated, Sean. That was amazing. And I love the hack on the donor advised fund. I think that is a brilliant point that I just would have completely forgotten about, frankly. So, yeah, you can donate appreciated stock and also to charities, like you said. It doesn't have to be through the donor advised fund. And you get the deduction, the charitable contribution deduction for the fair market value of the stock. And when you make that contribution, that unrealized gain that you had in there, poof, it's gone. You never have to pay the tax on that. So that's why donating, if you're going to make charitable donations, which many or most of us do, certainly, then donating appreciated stock is a very cool way to go about that.
Yeah, and the other thing too is it can sort of normalize the relationship with the charity. Few people in the audience want to give $20,000 to a charity this year in the form of stock, not even cash, and then say, "Well, I won't be in touch for the next 3 or 4 years until I give you another $20,000." Right? What you could do is put the $20,000 of stock in the donor advised fund. They sell it. They can you reinvest it in there, and usually a conservative holding. And then over the next few years, you dole out 1,000, 2,000, whatever it is, sort of the normal relationship. So that the relationship with the charity stays much more normal, and you get that juicy tax deduction up front, and you wipe away the capital gain on whatever you put into the donor advised fund.
Yeah, that is wonderful. All right, Sean, I think we thoroughly covered that question. I'm thrilled with that. I think we got all the points that I was hoping to hit on. So let's move on. I got a question from Andy. And he said, "Hey, Brad, it's been a year since I invested in the high interest I bonds from the US Treasury. Everyone was talking about these a year ago. It would be great if you could do a refresher on it and what to do with an I bond that has reached maturity." And that's the end of Andy's question. But yeah, I suspect there's more there necessarily than the reach maturity. I don't even know if that's technically the definition we'd go for, Sean. But there's a lot of just little nuance to I bonds, and there's two different types of interest rates that are applied to it. There's a 3-month clawback of interest. So obviously, you know all this. I'd love to hear you talk through. Okay, hey, I put some money in I bonds over the last couple of years. What do I do now?
Yeah, great question. The I bonds are sort of a funny product in terms of how they work. The correspondent mentioned maturity. Well, technically, my understanding is it's a 30-year maturity, but you can get out after 1 year. So your correspondent said they'd held for a year, so they can quote unquote get out. If they want to get out before the 5-year mark, so if they haven't held this thing for at least 5 years and they sell their I bonds, then what happens is they forfeit the last 3 months of interest, right? So in our world today, I would say that's not the biggest problem in the world, but it's something to be aware of, right? So if you've owned an I bond for say a year and a half, 18 months, and you sell it, you get 15 months worth of interest, not 18 months. So it's just something to be aware of. The other thing about it is the taxation, which can be very confusing. Generally, it boils down to something like this. The default, which most people do, is the interest income is not taxed until you exit. And recall how the interest income sort of builds up. If you have, say, $100 of I bonds and it pays, let's say, 12% interest, they never did, or at least not in recent vintage, but that gives me 1 month is 1%. So I had a $100 I bond. My interest payment in that first month is another $1 of I bonds. What they do is while you have the I bond holding, the interest is just paid in more bonds. So, after that first month, I have $101 worth of I bonds and so on and so forth. So when you get out of the position, you put, say, $100 in. Most people put something more like 10,000, but let's just say 100. And through the interest payments that have essentially been just added to the bond total, say I'm 18 months in, and now that's worth $120. If I cash out then, at that moment, the $20 becomes interest income. The Treasury is going to issue you a 1099 INT. And so that $20 when you cash out will hit your tax return as ordinary income. For those higher earners out there, will be subject to the 3.8% net investment income tax. So that's the default way and the way I think most people do it. In theory, you can affirmatively elect to tax yourself on the interest payments as they're coming. That requires A, more record keeping, and B, it's just going to be a lot more complicated, and C, it accelerates income. Now, maybe you think in the future when you cash out, you'll be at a much higher tax bracket. So it's not necessarily an irrational thing to do. But for most folks where the income's going to be roughly the same every year, it's probably not something you want to do.
Yeah. I'm also curious, and I suspect Andy is as well, about so the current interest rate. I think when many of us, and I know you're not a huge fan of these, but when many of us invested in them in, let's say, 2021, 2022, the rates were pretty significant. They were somewhere in the 8, 9+% range. And at last count, it was 4.3%. So you're now at a point where some online banks, Wealthfront and CIT Bank, they're giving you just in their traditional account basically higher than that at current moment. So you might have people say, hey, look, these I bonds, they're not really working for me anymore. I want to get out. Now you're in a position where, okay, if it's 4.3%, and like we said, there's that 3-month interest penalty. Now, presumably, you'd have to, I'm not 100% sure. I think it went down in May to that 4.3%. I know May is one of the times where they redo the interest.
Yeah, Brad, I'm actually looking at a US Treasury website here, and it says Series I savings bonds, 4.3% is the interest rate, and it's for bonds issued May 1, 2023 to October 31, 2023. So that 4.3%, I can send you the URL for this particular website. It's a Treasury website. That appears to be the correct rate. So that'll get reset presumably on November 1st.
Gotcha. Okay. So then, right, as we're recording this at the end of July, you would have been subject to that 4.3 for essentially May, June, and July. So you're getting real close to the point where, okay, 4.3% is what would have been applied for the 3 months prior. So then, okay, do you want to sell these at this point? And then obviously, very specifically what that penalty is going to be. Do you want to roll the dice and see what it's going to move to in November? And maybe it's significantly lower. And then your penalty, if you would sell it after November, December, January of 24, sometime in, let's say, February, I would be a little more conservative and probably wait until March. Maybe if the interest rate is lower, then that amount that you would have been clawed back as a penalty would be significantly smaller. So there are some considerations here, I guess, Sean, at the margins. But at the end of the day, I don't know that I'd necessarily do all these gyrations over what is probably not going to amount to all that much money if I really wanted my money out of there to move it to somewhere else.
Yeah, look, I'm not here to give investment advice to anyone in the audience, but I'll say this. I think about someone looking for financial independence, right? In most cases, that person is going to want a financial asset portfolio of at least $1 million, right? Your mileage may vary. The number might be a lot higher, the number might be a lot lower, but let's just say they want $1 million and you're only able to put $10,000 into these things every year. So, I step back and I say, well, am I going to get all that interested or excited on something that can only be, say, 1% of my portfolio, and then have some bells and whistles and, whatever you want to say about an FDIC online savings account? It's pretty flexible and you have a whole host of institutions and websites you can use. So I sort of like that flexibility, vis-a-vis, say, an I bond, which, like you're saying, Brad, maybe just isn't as flexible as some of these other arrangements.
Yeah. All right. So I think we covered that pretty thoroughly. Why don't we move on? So we have another question that came in from Lisa. And Lisa said, I just heard on one of the podcasts that the formula for financial independence is to take your expenses and multiply by 25. And that's how much you should have. And that's this, my sidebar is that's the very rough rule of thumb of the 4% rule. And Lisa went on to say, my question is, where does it take into account what your age or life expectancy is? Let's say I'm 25 when I'm hitting that versus 65. That makes a significant difference, she's saying. What am I missing? So, all right, Sean, what is she missing, if anything? How would you answer that question of FI, life expectancy versus when you get to that point of financial independence, et cetera. There's a couple of intertwining ideas here, certainly.
Well, and your correspondent is absolutely right to be questioning whether the 4% rule just blanket applies for all ages. And I would say no, it does not. It's a great initial cut. Now, I would also say there aren't going to be too many 25-year-olds who are ready for financial independence outside of an inheritance, right? So it's probably not going to be an issue there. And so the 4% rule comes from, I believe it's a Trinity study. I've posted on my blog on this. Basically, it comes from testing that was done in the 1990s around a financial asset portfolio surviving for 30 years. And would it be depleted before the end of the 30 years? And the authors, or back then, they said, well, if you had a 4% withdrawal rate, then you had a high likelihood that it would not be depleted within 30 years. Now, if you're 25 years old or even 35 years old, 30 years probably isn't good enough, right? Your life expectancy is almost certainly more than 30 years. Anything can happen, but anything can happen both directions, right? So I do think, Brad, you started this off with the right cut, which is, look, it's a general rule of thumb, meaning if we look at everyone who's listening to the Choosify podcast this Monday afternoon, the average retirement of that audience might be something like 30 years, right? There are going to be people in that audience who might be in their 70s and they probably don't have 30 more years, right? There are going to be some people in that audience in their 20s. And even if they retire today, it's going to be more than 30 years. And there are going to be people in their 50s and 60s and 70s where 30 years is a good approximation, right? So the 4% rule is just an approximation. And you have to look at, well, how much longer do you have to have, say, downside events? And yeah, if you're 85 years old, would I be constrained by 4%? Absolutely not. But if I was, say, retiring and I'm 55 years old, I say, well, that might be a good initial cut and I might want to be a little more conservative or maybe a little more aggressive. Now, in theory, most folks invest for a return more than 4%, right? Most people would not be happy with a 4% annual return. So in theory, the 4% rule is setting up a perpetual money-making machine, right? I invest my portfolio, I'm going for 5, 6, 7% returns. If I only spent 4%, as long as I'm alive, I'm just going to be growing the pie. But we know that's just the theory. And we know that the stock market and even the bond market have declines. And so that's why there's at least some conservatism there by baking in 4%.
Yep, wholeheartedly agree. And I know Carson from Early Retirement Now has talked about this in depth, both here on the show and in his Safe Withdrawal Rate series. So I would definitely say everybody should check that out if you're interested in the real intricacies of this, because there is a lot of nuance. But like you're alluding to, Sean, it's okay, this is a 4% rule of thumb. And yeah, there's always different considerations. Like I know I probably personally am a little more conservative when it comes to my money. And if the time comes when I have to start withdrawing, right, I'm earning $0 of income at that point, I probably would shoot for something like what Carson has said is almost like a metaphysical certainty of success. And I'm paraphrasing him. He's not saying those exact words, but like 3.25%. And that's not even including Social Security, which I think almost certainly will exist in some significant manner when it comes time for me to get Social Security at that point. And also, frankly, I'm paying a significant amount every month for health insurance premiums. And I won't be eventually when I'm on Medicare. So all of these things, like I'm assuming essentially in my own world for the most conservative manner possible. And therefore, I think there's a really high probability that my money, my nest egg will outlive me at that point. But I'm not diving into every Monte Carlo simulation and trying to figure out the exact. I am using the knowledge that I've gleaned from my own learning and certainly from many of my guests. And I'm pretty confident with that. But like we said, the main goal of I think of the 4% rule for the FI community is a North Star. And I think that's what's so beautiful about it is it takes this concept, which is nebulous at best or purposely confusing at worst, which is you hear often like, oh, you're never going to be able to retire. You need 10, $20 million. Think about healthcare, all these horror stories, and actually turning it into something that's very specific. Okay, I know what my life costs. I can control that. I multiply that by 25 to get my FI number. And that is my North Star guiding light. You can get into the nuance after that, but as a real quick back of the envelope item, I think that's pretty darn good, Sean.
I agree. I 100% agree that, yes, we should not be saying, you know what, I can only retire when I have $5 million. Well, why do you believe that? And then let's talk about how much could you take from a portfolio. And then the other thing too, Brad, is consumption, right? Sometimes when we think about failure in the 4% rule, Michael Kitts has made this point on the Bigger Pockets podcast years ago. You're not just going to march off the cliff, meaning if for whatever reason the financial assets are not doing so well, you are going to make some adjustments to your spending, many of which, frankly, are not that impactful from a lived experience perspective. And you're probably not going to march right off the cliff and just have financial failure.
Agreed wholeheartedly. All right. Well, that was a fantastic question from Lisa. Sean, let's move on. So, this was in our Facebook group. So, our Choose a Five Facebook group, I don't think I mentioned this on the podcast, but recently passed a major milestone of 100,000 members. We're up to almost 102,000 members now, which is just remarkable. It is just the most significant community of people pursuing financial independence in the world. And yeah, it's really amazing what goes on in there. So, chooseabuy.com/Facebook will redirect to get you there pretty quick. And Janelle asked this question. She said, my children would like to open a Fidelity Index Fund account for themselves. They are both under 16 years old. What is the best account to start them with? All right, so Sean, I know you don't love bests because that's by necessity giving advice. We're not going to answer best, but we'll say, okay, like we talked about before, there are many places to invest. Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard are the three that come to mind for me. But again, we're kind of agnostic with that. Somebody wants to open an investing account for their kids. What do they have to consider? What should they do? How would they go about this?
Yeah. So the first thing I would think about is mom and dad's own financial security. And where's this money coming from, right? If it's coming from the grandparents, it's coming from the grandparents. That is what it is. But if it's mom and dad and they haven't yet reached financial independence, I'd actually reevaluate, right? Because the best thing you could do for your kids financially is solidify your own finances and get yourself to financial independence. So that's item one. For a 16-year-old, sort of an interesting issue there. There are different options, right? There's UGMA and UTMA. So these are uniform transfers to minors accounts, uniform gifts to minors accounts. You could set those up as taxable brokerage accounts with the particular financial institution. And my understanding is you generally name a guardian on those, right? So the parent is going to be so-called guardian of those accounts. The other thing you could consider, there's no age minimum on a Roth IRA. So maybe the kid works at summer camp or McDonald's or at the mall and they're getting a W-2. And, one exercise you could do with your child is, they're 16 years old. They worked at summer camp. In January, they get a W-2 from that, right? And it says $1,800, $2,100, whatever it is. You could point out how these rules work. You'd say, hey, Junior, you got 2,100 on this W-2. It says you earned $2,100. That means we can contribute up to that amount to a Roth IRA in your name. That's absolutely legal, and that sets up tax-free growth for them. And it also sort of shows them the process of retirement saving, right? So it says, oh, okay, I had earned income. That translates into this ability to do a Roth IRA, which then translates into tax-free growth. So that would be another option. Brad, I know you're the dad of two young daughters. I mean, I think you'd have some very interesting insights on this as well.
Yeah, well, I definitely do. And I've kind of built some financial lessons into it, which is actually the fun part. I think for my kids, it's how I consider why I'm teaching them about finances. It's not necessarily to make them wealthy tomorrow. That's not the issue. It's to give them the fundamental building blocks of how to build a financial life. And I think what I've done is, well, we do different things in terms of their allowance, which we have separated into savings, giving, and then spending. And I think spending is important. And we let them run free with that. But the savings, we essentially make it so they save 50% of their allowance. And then I actually go through and I sit down with them and I show them, all right, this is in your bank account. We're going to transfer it. They happen to have accounts at Vanguard. We're going to transfer it to Vanguard. We do have a UTMA account for them. And Sean, I do want to ask you some specific nuance because I'm sure somebody's going to have this question of UTMA versus UGMA, because I suspect most people, myself included, don't really know that readily off the top of our heads. So then I show them the money and it transfers and it takes a couple days. And then we go and log into Vanguard and purchase whatever it may be, VTSAX or VTI, or my older daughter is now a roller coaster enthusiast. So she's actually, and I don't necessarily advocate this, but she's been buying Cedar Fair stock, which is her favorite company that owns 11 different amusement parks. So it's fun because she's building lessons into it. We're hopefully going to go to the shareholders meeting and all this thing. So I know this probably wasn't exactly where you're expecting me to go, Sean, but I think
Yep.
that's the fun part of this is you can build lessons into this. And yeah, every time they get a gift, again, we go through the same process. It gets transferred over, then it gets purchased, and they get a sense of, okay, how long does this take? I log in with them, let's say once a year or so, to show them the gains that they've earned or potential losses, right? Unrealized, of course. But I think there's a lot you can do here. So yeah, we have a bank account for them and then this UTMA. But I will be quiet now and let you run with, hey,
Yeah.
UTMA versus UGMA.
Yeah. So if I were setting up one of those, I would reach out to the relevant financial institution and see how they want to do it. Right. So there are some different nuances between UGMA and UTMA. They're not huge. So I'll give you like one little nickel dime one. Apparently, the states of Vermont and South Carolina do not have one of them. And I'm just looking that back up. So apparently, Vermont and South Carolina, look, talk to a lawyer in those two states, but apparently they don't allow UTMA. So you'd have to do a UGMA in those states. Now, my understanding is both UGMA accounts and UTMA, and the difference between the T and the G is gift and T is transfer. Apparently, the big difference is the custody of physical assets, not financial assets. Both can have financial assets. So, what I would do is I'd probably reach out to your relevant financial institution and say, hey, which one do you do? They may only do one or the other. And it's not the sort of thing that would be a deal breaker for me. So, if you call XYZ financial institution, hey, we only do UTMAs, as long as you're not in, I guess, Vermont or South Carolina, that's fine, right? I wouldn't be splitting hairs over that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And then just last note on this is you mentioned the Roth IRA, and we have an article, I'll put this in the show notes on chooseify.com called Make Your Kid a Millionaire, Roth IRA for Kids. And I know that's a bit of a sensational title, but I think this can be a really valuable investment vehicle, especially if you can start getting money in there for your kids to compound at whatever it is, 13, 14, 15 years old. And I forget the exact number you mentioned in your example before. Maybe it was $2,100 or something, but it's important to note that let's say they have earned income in a calendar year of that amount. We'll say my memory is right and we'll say it's $2,100 and you want to make a contribution to the Roth IRA. I know this is a subtle distinction, but it's important. It doesn't have to be those dollars.
That's right. Yeah. Money is fungible.
Money is fungible. They can spend that money and you could make, if you wanted to give them a gift or show them, again, for a financial lesson, hey, I'm going to essentially match 100%, or you can do any kind of thing. You could just put in the $2,100, but they have the space then, because again, they have $2,100 of earned income in that calendar year. They can put $2,100 into that Roth IRA for that tax year, essentially.
Yeah. And it would actually be, the W 2, whatever you want to say about it, a 16-year-old, 17-year-old, 18-year-old could learn some lessons about personal finance. They could learn about FICA tax withholding. What the heck is that? And how earned income is reported to you, and then how that can support a Roth IRA contribution. So I think it can be a good learning opportunity. And yeah, $2,100 going tax free is not going to be paradigm shifting, right, as they say. But yeah, every little bit counts. And yeah, let that grow 60, 70 years. That could be some real money.
Yeah, that could be paradigm shifting there. So, all right, this is great. I think we covered that. Let's, since we've been talking about Roth IRAs, we're going to round out the mailbag here with two different issues with Roth IRAs. So, we're going to start with Jordan, who actually is from the website The Wealth Letters, and real good guy. He sent me this DM on Twitter. He said, I'm wondering if one of your newsletters or podcasts, if you could do a deep dive, if there are times where it makes sense to do Roth IRA conversions before one is retired. I know Roth IRA conversions are usually reserved for when one hits retirement, but if one is already in the middle of a tax bracket, for example, would it make sense to do conversions to reach the top of said bracket? Now, Sean, that's obviously a very specific question, but I guess just more broadly is Roth IRA conversions for people who have more than $0 of taxable income, let's say, right? So they have a normal W 2.
Yeah. So the first thing I think about is a concept from a frequent guest of the podcast, Jillian Johnsrud, the mini retirement. So let's just say you're working a W 2 job and you say, you know what, I'm going to take a year off, and that begins February 1st. Okay. So you have a month in January where you get that W 2 income. Maybe it's 6,500, 7,500. Well, that's for a contribution. You could do a contribution and a conversion, right? So in those years where maybe you're not fully retired, but you're taking a sabbatical and you have 6 months, 9 months, 11 months where you're essentially not getting a W 2, that could be a time for a Roth conversion, essentially doing an opportunistic Roth conversion. Some people take nonprofit or government jobs for a short time. That could be a time to do a Roth conversion, depending on your circumstances. But the correspondent is really onto something. Generally speaking, especially for those who are very attuned to personal finance, they tend to be at their highest marginal tax brackets during their working years, not their retirement years. That's particularly true later in a career. So if you're doing that Roth conversion, you're doing it at the marginal bracket for both federal and state purposes. So that argues against doing the Roth conversion because in the FI community, we have a reasonable hope. It's a reasonable hope. It is not a guarantee, but our reasonable hope is that when we retire, we will be in lower tax brackets, both from a marginal perspective and even an effective perspective, i.e., just averaging everything together. We have a reasonable hope that if we get retired somewhat early by conventional standards, we're going to have years where we are going to be in relatively low marginal tax brackets. And that's when the Roth conversion is going to make the most sense.
Yep, agreed wholeheartedly. And so, right, that is probably the traditional FI advice is, yeah, since you can control what you can control, and if you're at true FI where you're not earning any earned income, then you have a significant amount more space, let's say, at those
Yep.
lowest tax brackets. But at the end of the day, this is your personal decision, right? So
Yeah.
we can't know. You said reasonable hope, right? We can't know what future marginal rates are going to be, et cetera. Wherever you are, like Jordan said, okay, I'm in the middle of a tax bracket. Okay, well, that makes sense. Then, if you've judged that you are okay paying that tax, because that is a taxable event, this Roth IRA conversion for that amount, and that makes sense to you based on what you know about the world and what you know about your personal situation, okay, then do it. That's reasonable.
Yeah, and let me just add 2 points to that. One, no one is going to be on their deathbed saying, boy, I converted too early and I didn't optimize. No one is going to have that experience, right? Maybe you convert too early, you don't optimize. It's not the worst thing. The second thing to consider is it's not really the approach I usually take, but I think it is worth mentioning, and it's a valid point, I believe, which is this: pay expenses when we know we can afford to pay them, right? So your correspondent might be saying, look, this was a good year, say, and I'm in the middle of a tax bracket and I know I can afford to pay the tax. Why not take on to your younger, healthier self an expense that you know you can afford, even if it's not optimized, rather than potentially kicking that can down the road to an older, potentially less healthy self that is not going to have the ability to generate additional income in the way that you have it today. So there is an argument to be made to pay expenses when we know we can pay them.
Yeah. All right, that was great, Sean. I think we thoroughly covered that. So we do have one other aspect of the Roth IRA to close out the mailbag here. And also, I'm glad you mentioned Jillian Johnsrud because I'm actually chatting with her tomorrow, and that episode's going to come out in the next couple of weeks. So everybody, stay tuned. Jillian hasn't been on for a while, so that should be absolutely wonderful. And I guess the last thing here, and no, I don't have a particular question because I think we've both seen this a number of times, which actually made you go out and write an article that is going to be published imminently. I'm not sure if by the time this episode comes out, but there are two different 5 year, I guess, rules, let's say, when it relates to Roth IRAs. And I think there's a lot of confusion when it comes to these two different 5 years. Can you just illuminate us basically on what these are, how they work, et cetera?
Yeah. So, by the way, for the listeners, you can go to my fitaxguy.com blog, and the post will be up by the time that certainly the episode drops. So, the thesis of my blog post is this: don't worry about those 5 year clocks. So, sometimes they're referred to as the 5 year clock, sometimes they're referred to as the 5 year rules. You use the nomenclature you're comfortable with. Okay. People get a little bent out of shape. And I will say this: I've recently seen some content creation in the financial media space that has gotten them wrong. So, look, we all make mistakes, right? These things are confusing. But I will say, one, they are rarely applicable. right? So just remember that the way the rules work, the odds that you would trip one of these clocks are low, not non-existent, but low. Let's go over the 2 5-year rules. The first 5-year rule is a rule about Roth IRA earnings. It says you have to have owned any Roth IRA for at least 5 years before you could take a tax-free withdrawal of earnings inside a Roth IRA. Okay, let's think about that for a second. Well, one, most people contributing to a Roth IRA aren't even going to want to touch that Roth IRA in terms of distributions out for way more than 5 years. Two, that rule tends to have no effect. Here's the reason why. The rules say you can only get earnings tax free if you're both 59 and a half or older and you meet this 5-year clock. So I go through some examples where I say, look, so and so is 25 years old. They take out at 28 years old. Their result is the exact same if they're 25 years old, contribute and take out at 35 years old, right? The 59 and a half year rule tends to be the rule. This 5-year rule tends to be just sort of this useless add-on. It has no impact because you're not 59 and a half anyway. Then third, contributions come out before earnings come out. So quick example for you, Brad. I'm under 50 years old. I make a $6,500 Roth IRA contribution. It's the only contribution I ever make. 2 years from now, I take out, say, 3,000 of the 6,500 in growth. It's all a return of contributions, right? That's the ordering rule. So that rule tends to, the only time it bites is if you're over 59 and a half, ironically, and even that's a rare fact pattern. So that rule is almost superfluous, even though people get all bent out of shape over it.
Yeah, they certainly do get bent out of shape. And just one quick note, which you kind of alluded to in there, is Roth IRA contributions can be withdrawn tax and penalty free at any age, at any time, for any reason. So
That's
that's
correct.
the critical piece. So that's further, even though you said it's superfluous and yada, yada, yada. In most cases, most people aren't going to make withdrawals from these things anyway. And if they are, it's going to be up to those contributions. So this is moot on so many levels in all
Yeah.
likelihood.
Yeah. And not only can Roth contributions come out anytime, any reason, tax and penalty free, they come out first, the ordering rule, right? That's what's really protecting us here. Plus the issue of this 59 and a half thing, which punishes you if you ever did access earnings. Doesn't matter if you meet the 5-year rule. If you're under 59, there's two very rare exceptions. My blog post goes through them, but those are very rare exceptions. So pretty much the 59 and a half rule is the rule that sort of governs this one.
Got it. All right. So fitaxguy.com, the article will be on there, but there's the other important 5-year clock.
Yeah, and this clock does have more effect. Even this clock, though, has very minimal effect, but it has more effect. It's a more important rule. This rule says if and only if you're under age 59 and a half, you take a distribution from a Roth IRA that is attributable to a previously taxable Roth conversion. Within 5 years of having made that conversion, you have to pay the 10% penalty. It's not an income tax, right? So you don't pay income tax on the withdrawal of that conversion. You pay the 10% penalty if and only if two things are true. You're under age 59 and a half, and it's been less than 5 years since that conversion. So this rule matters, but those ordering rules we alluded to, they save you here most of the time. Why? Because regular annual contributions come out first before you'd ever access any of these taxable conversions. And not only that, taxable conversions come out second, and they come out FIFO. That's a terrible accounting term. Sorry to have introduced it to the audience. First in, first out. So say you've done Roth conversions in each year from, say, 2010 through 2020. If you ran out of withdrawal space from your old annual contributions, you would start withdrawing your old conversion starting in 2010. That conversion comes out first. Then the 2011 conversion comes out, the 2012. So the oldest conversions come out first, making it that much less likely you would access a younger than 5-year-old conversion. But if you do, before age 59 and a half, you will pay the 10% early withdrawal penalty.
Okay. That all makes sense. And so the Roth IRA conversion ladder is something that we've talked about on the podcast a couple times. It's outside of the scope of what we're doing today. But for anybody interested, go back way into the archives. We'll have a link in the show notes for both of these, but it's episode 17R and 163R. We used to do these roundup episodes that were appended with R. So 17R, 163R. We talked through a couple different case studies. That's really important. And Sean, my final question actually is about that 59 and a half and the 5 year, the implication of that. So let's say you made a Roth IRA conversion when you were 57.
Yes.
Right now, theoretically, under normal circumstances, if you were much younger, you wouldn't be able to access that until you were 5 years later, so 62. But 59 and a half comes in the intervening time. Ordering rules, what happens?
And Brad, am I assuming that this is the only contribution of any type that anybody's ever made to a Roth IRA? So they start at
Sure.
57?
Yep. Just
Yeah.
to make it easy, streamline it. Yep.
Let's say it's the 57th birthday. So it's sort of an interesting fact pattern. I'm glad you raised that. That's a really good fact pattern. So for the next 2.5 years, a withdrawal of the contribution itself, which would come out first, that conversion itself, is subject to the 10% early withdrawal penalty. So that's one problem they have. That's the second 5 year rule. So they have a 2.5 year handcuff on the withdrawal of the conversion itself, right? So that's one thing they're subject to. They're subject to something else. If in the next 5 years, so through age 62, through the 60, or, we'd have to look at the tax years
Right.
when it happened in the
Roughly.
tax year. So it's not actually the 62nd birthday. But basically, for the next 5 years, they're also subject to the first 5 year rule on the earnings only. So if they withdraw all the contributions, right, you have to assess that against the 2.5 years on the early withdrawal penalty. But if they get past that, they could maybe now withdraw all the conversion amount. If they dip into earnings prior to the passing of the fifth tax year, then they're going to be subject on the earnings only to income tax, not the penalty, unless they're before 59 and a half, then they're subject to the penalty as well. But they would be subject to the income tax through the end of the fifth taxable year, even though that takes them beyond 59 and a half. 59 and a half matters for a qualified distribution. People think about it with the early withdrawal penalty. It has this little nuance here just on the earnings piece, where, you could be over 59 and a half and still pay an income tax on a distribution from a Roth IRA because you don't meet the 5 year holding period. That's the first rule. Again, though, Brad, you came up with a very unique fact pattern to trigger us where we have to worry about these rules. Most people start contributing in their 20s and 30s and 40s, build up runway in terms of old contributions, and pretty much never have to worry about these rules.
Yep, wholeheartedly agree. Of course, my fact pattern muddled it a little bit here at the end, but you gave a lovely, crisp answer to that. And there's some nuance, but the nuance is important. So if for the person out there who that's relevant to, they just got their answer, which is great. So Sean, this has been phenomenal. I think we covered everything we set out to cover in the mailbag, and I'd certainly love to do multiple of these in the future with you if you're up for it. And yeah, just thanks for being here.
Brad, thanks so much. Would love to come back anytime.
Awesome. So, Sean, obviously, we said fitaxguy.com, and we have this amazing Roth IRA article. Anywhere else you want to direct people to?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and my financial planning firm website is mullaneyfinancial.com.
Awesome. All right, Sean, until next time, thanks again.
Thank you, Brad.